DA, Chapter 71, Doubts of the Heart 2. Medusa POV. Medusa calmly walked through the entrance of the Grand Temple, otherwise known as the Primordial Temple and location of the new council's throne room. She calmly strolled through the large archway leading into the building, giving polite nods to some gods and titans moving about their ways. Honestly, with every day this place gets busier and busier, she thought as she narrowly avoided a nature goddess running off with a list for some new plants to be arranged in the second district. She smiled though as thought on all the progress being made thanks to the ideas of the new council. From now on, even if only part-time, every god actively participated in a job or practice. Most obviously sought jobs relatable to their domains, and now thanks to having official Canadian citizenship, some gods were even going as far as setting up employment with mortals. Heck, Rhea was already working on setting up an official tree farm to subtly start to spread out blessed trees to increase the health of her domain. Obviously there were some gods grumbling about it, but truthfully most of them had plenty of free time on their hands and they could use an outlet rather than causing mischief. Another ruling by the council had been gods needing to take responsibility for their children and their mortal lovers. Failure to do so could lead to fines, community service, and in case of abuse, possible arrest or Andromeda stripping the offending god's ability to have children. Luckily no one had done anything demanding of more than a slap on the wrist, and even some of the children from the orphanage have been adopted. Maybe I'll visit Leto and help around later today, she mused as she turned down a hall leading to the main offices of the Protogonoi. However, as she turned she spotted Andromeda on her way to her office looking rather downtrodden. That made Medusa frown, and before she even thought about it, she'd already changed plans from meeting up with her master to speaking with one of her best friends. So, with a quickness to her step she followed up to the love goddess, meeting her just before she closed the door to her office. Andy, she called, making the goddess start in her direction. Medusa, Andy said softly with a forced smile. Can I help you with anything? Medusa looked at her intently for a few minutes before saying softly, not really, but you look like you could use a friendly ear. That made Andy's eyes widen, but before she could try to deny anything Medusa pushed on. You're terrible at hiding your feelings, Andy, she said before stepping closer. What's wrong? Andromeda didn't reply immediately, instead leaning her head past Medusa to make sure no one else was in the hallways before suddenly grabbing Medusa's hand and pulling her in through the door with a startled squeak. Before she knew it, Medusa was in the office and taking in the sights for the first time while Andy locked the door behind them. Huh, not what I expected, she muttered as she looked around. Andromeda's office was a large library shaped as a tower made of white marble with the door in the bottom floor. She looked up and couldn't even see the ceiling, with shelves upon shelves of tablets of all things. Each one was roughly 6 by 6 inches with a glowing heart icon on the edge towards the inside, much like the barcodes. Fluttering around the library were hundreds of small birds of paradise, Andromeda's chosen animals, each moving around tablets. Medusa watched the little birds work, noting the types of labels on some floors and shelves such as mystic or mortal, then smaller divisions with gender, age divisions by generations, and country nationality. Like my system? Andy asked her as she stepped up to look at her office as well. I'm just impressed with how your mind works, Medusa replied. She'd had it explained to her by Percy. These offices were essentially physical representations of the mind of each primordial. With all the sheer input from their domains, regardless of how powerful and complex the minds of gods could be, they were bound to miss small details from time to time. That's why they created these offices, to double-check their domains and prioritize certain actions. Is that just because I'm a love goddess? Andy asked with a mock scowl. Would it be better if there were nothing but clouds and pink balloons? I didn't say anything, Medusa replied innocently, getting a small giggle from the goddess. They remained in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Medusa sighed and asked again, so Andy, what's bothering you? Andromeda didn't really reply other than letting her shoulders slump as her eyes became cloudy. It's complicated, she mumbled as one of her birds landed on her shoulder and started to nip at her cheek affectionately, getting a small smile out of the goddess. Andy, Medusa whispered as she placed a reassuring hand on her free shoulder and squeezed softly. Andromeda took a shuddering breath before finally relenting, looking at Medusa with watery eyes. I love him. Who? Medusa asked with a frown, trying to think of anyone she'd seen Andromeda look at in particular, but nothing came to mind. Whoever it was, Andy mumbled the name too low for Medusa to catch. Who? Percy, Andy squeaked out before turning her face away while her bird squawked while nearly falling off from the sudden movement. Medusa for her part looked at the goddess in confusion before going on. Well duh, I would assume you love him, pretty much everyone does. No. Andy snapped with more strength while looking back at Medusa. I love him. It took Medusa a few seconds before it finally clicked, leaving her to blink owlishly before murmuring, oh, I see. Andromeda hung her head in defeat after that before nodding slowly. And let me guess. You can't bring yourself to tell him, right? She asked, getting another nod from Andy. Are you scared that he might not return the feelings? Can't you check beforehand? It's not that simple, Andy replied as she started to scratch her bird's head softly. Primordials are different to all other beings. Our thoughts and actions are beyond prediction unless the emotions are incredibly strong or dead set for a very long time. That's why there aren't any prophecies for us or for Nyx when she contacted Percy. The fates aren't all-knowing and they can't directly see what a primordial will decide and the repercussions of those decisions. So they could see Gaia's doom since she was planning her war for millennia, Medusa said with a thoughtful look as Andy nodded. Yeah, and even then the prophecy didn't pan out since Gaia didn't fall to storm or fire. But the point is that I can't read his emotions either, at least, not if he isn't aware of them himself or hides them, she said as she walked towards one of the shelves as her bird fluttered away. I can say without a doubt that Percy, Rhea, and Hestia are all absolutely in love with each other since they don't hide it in any way, but I can't tell if his love for me is more that of sibling love. And if I tried to check, he would feel it. And you can't ask him to let you search around a little? Medusa asked as she followed after her. I'm sure he wouldn't have a problem with it. Because it's a two-way street and he might feel my emotions too, she replied. And then what if he finds out I love him but he doesn't return those feelings? She asked with a slight quiver in her voice. But he might, Medusa persisted only for Andy to lower her head again. It isn't just love that I want, she mumbled. Well, what else is it? Andy, you need to tell me if you want me to help at all, Medusa persisted, getting the goddess to look at her in the eyes. They stared for a few minutes in tense silence before Andromeda took a shuddering breath and then went on to explain everything. How her love had turned from sibling to romantic, how her domains had all focused on Percy, much to Andy's embarrassment about wanting kids with him, which got a snort and a good luck from Medusa. However, any teasing Medusa might have had planned flew out the window the moment Andy explained the effects of holding herself back were having for her. Still, it seemed to her that Andy needed something positive to think about, so she tried to push the conversation along. You don't seriously think he would treat you any differently even if he didn't return your feelings, right? Medusa asked softly. I mean, come on. It's Percy we're talking about here. Still, Andromeda mumbled as she absently reached for a tablet and checked a screen displaying some guy with a blue heart icon. Medusa watched silently as Andy tapped some icons and used her finger to write some things in before raising the tablet and letting one of her birds whisk it away. She watched the bird fly off to one of the higher levels with it before spotting 3 entire floor that was labeled, blacklisted, with all the heart icons being solid back and even some looked cracked. The blacklist, Andy commented as she noted where Medusa was looking. Those are the people who have caused irreparable damage to my domains of love and procreation. At Medusa's silent look the goddess continued. It's for those that have murdered the innocent, and those that have committed rape. Medusa swallowed thickly as she tried in vain to even count the tablets. They were also divided and she could see similar markers to the regular floors, but still, the sheer number. How many? She asked softly. Tens of thousands, she replied with a clearly disgusted growl in her voice. And because of the ancient laws I can just will for all of them to spontaneously combust or something. You could go one by one and hunt them all down though, Medusa replied with a shrug before asking. Are you already working on creating a guardian or vassals to safeguard your domains? At that Andromeda's eyes widened before she nodded shyly, which caused Medusa to narrow her eyes. Can I see what you have? Medusa probed as Andy nervously tapped her fingers together. Okay, just don't tell anyone, she said softly as she started to walk to one of the walls as a set of stairs materialized leading to the second floor. Medusa followed behind as she watched the goddess, wondering what it was that was making her so nervous now. She let her thoughts stew as they arrived and Medusa saw a new door appearing between some shelves, but this one looked oddly science-techy with even a damn scanned and number pad on the side. She watched in amusement as Andromeda tapped a ridiculously long number code and then placed her hand on the scanner. The door then slid open with a loud hiss, a fine mist billowing out making Medusa gawk at the goddess and said goddess glancing back at her with a giggle. Are you becoming a mad scientist or something? Medusa asked as they walked into the currently dark room, which was odd considering Medusa should be able to see in absolute darkness. No, but I heard Styx has a similar lab in her office and there were a few explosions when she was experimenting with her lava, Andromeda answered while Medusa snickered. Okay, but what is it you have in here? Medusa asked as she still couldn't see anything and they were well into the darkened room already. Fine, Andy finally relented before the lights suddenly sprang up making Medusa blink away the little lights in her eyes. Once she readjusted her eyes widened to the size of dinner plates with her mouth hanging open. Yeah, I thought you might react like that, Andy sighed while Medusa remained silent. In the large lab room, at the very center on a raised platform was a large pillar made of some unknown, lilac crystal. Surrounding the pillar were several monitors and screens, tables with notes, and even a table with vials of odd liquids and some tools commonly found in medical rooms. However, what really had Medusa's attention was what was currently inside the pillar. There, floating in a light pink and translucent liquid was a naked girl that looked to be about 17. She was slightly less than Andromeda's height, around 5 feet 7 or so with a curvy, just shy of busty figure, long legs, and long flowing black hair. Her skin was tan and flawless, with her face having a small buttoned nose and high cheekbones on a heart-shaped face. Medusa looked at the girl intensely for over a minute before looking back to Andy, and then back to the girl. The resemblances were uncanny to the love goddess, but she wasn't the only one Medusa was finding similarities to. In fact, as Medusa peered closer she could just make out a slight tip of fangs bumping out from the relaxed lips. Cute. Looks just like when he. Medusa's thoughts stopped as she went ramrod straight and slowly turned to look at the fidgeting goddess trying to look as innocent as possible. Andromeda, Xena, Jackson, Medusa said slowly as Andy flinched with each one of her names called. Yays. Care to explain to me your guardian, looks like you and Percy? Medusa asked as she stared down the goddess, hands on her hips. Andromeda stammered for a minute before taking a deep breath. You know how creation for gods work, right? You concentrate your pure divine power and mentally build from the ground up, usually adding traits and influences from either your domain or with the permission of another god for other domains. Poseidon created the horses and then to appease his brother from an argument, got permission to use the sky domain before adding wings to create the Pegasus, otherwise Zeus would have shot every single one out of the sky, she recited with ease. Right, and if the creation has a god's blood. She continued while looking more and more nervous by the minute. It makes the difference between the creature being mortal or immortal and adds a higher influence or affinity for certain domains, and could add abilities similar to their parents, she answered instantly. Okay, well, Andromeda paused for a moment as she collected herself while Medusa started tapping her foot. Then, in one quick breath Andy answer. My procreation domain was a little wild and I wanted to consider her my dar so she has my blood and Percy's. What? Medusa asked after trying and failing to decipher what the goddess said for a minute. Andromeda wringed her hands for a bit before taking another breath and answering in a calmer voice. Percy had already given me his blood with his permission to use the influence of night, but my procreation domain was acting up when I was shaping her, she said pointing to the slumbering girl. So I might have changed her from being an avian of some sort to being mainly humanoid, and since she also comes from my blood. She's your daughter, with Percy's, Medusa finished as Andy nodded slowly. Quote. You do realize that if Rhea and Hestia find out your ass is grass, right? A nod. Oh good, I call dibs on your wolf plushie. Quote. So care to explain why was it that you lost control of your domain for a moment that led to this? Medusa asked as she finally looked away from the goddess and back to the sleeping immortal. She heard Andy sigh before explaining. It wasn't intentional, it's just that when I found him to ask for his blood, he was visiting Leto's orphanage. He gave it to me no problem, but then I stuck around and watched him playing with the kids and there was a high-pitched squeal getting Medusa to glance back at the excited goddess. I couldn't stop picturing him with kids afterwards, and I was daydreaming about what kids between us would look like. Okay, so she satisfies one of your domains? Medusa asked getting a nod from the goddess. So what can she do? What's her purpose? That got a scowl from Andy, so Medusa quickly backtracked a little. Not like that. I know, you just said that she's your daughter even if she didn't grow inside you. I just meant that you still must have given her a purpose if you've taken the time to slowly create her. D.A. Chapter 72, Doubts of the Heart 3. That got a scowl from Andy, so Medusa quickly backtracked a little. Not like that. I know, you just said that she's your daughter even if she didn't grow inside you. I just meant that you still must have given her a purpose if you've taken the time to slowly create her. That seemed to pacify the goddess enough for her to explain as she walked past Medusa and laid a hand against the pillar. Medusa also noted that the girl twitched at the contact to her container, meaning she could probably feel her mother's presence. She'll be the first of my own form of hunters, Andromeda explained as she carefully looked at her sleeping daughter. They'll hunt after those that have been blacklisted and end them in my place. So like Percy's wolves getting free rein to rip apart poachers and other possibly unsavory company within their territories, Medusa commented as she stepped closer as well. Andy hummed as she tapped one of the screens showing a heart rate and other readings. Yes, and to do it I gave her a variety of abilities. She is strong enough to overpower any human and most demigods, but her focus will be speed and agility. Thanks to Percy, she'll have excellent senses and have more energy during the night. Wait, Medusa interrupted as she looked at the goddess. So you just recreated and perfected the vampire? What? No, she isn't a vampire, Andy retorted, but then Medusa pointed at the fang tips visible. That's probably inherited from Percy, now let me finish. She huffed before taking a moment to get back into her lecture mode. Anyways, that's as far as her abilities inherited through Percy's blood should go. On my end, I gave her the ability to sense emotions related to my domain so she can easily pick out those that are blacklisted, can manipulate her age like me, and she has the ability to see fantasies. What? Medusa asked, only for Andy to scowl at her more. Sorry. What I mean by that is that she can see a person's most hidden desires, making it difficult to lie to her and play on that to get close to them. Seduction is a powerful weapon and a good majority of her targets will be easier to disarm if you play on their hidden desires. So she'll be a master seductress and assassin, Medusa wrapped up. Essentially, Andromeda agreed with a nod before she got a pensive look. Thing is, I'm not sure if I should even awaken her. Why not? Medusa asked with a frown before she paused to think about it. Sure, in a way Andy went behind Rhea and Hestia's backs to have a child with Percy, which would certainly raise a few issues. But then again, though it was a cold way of looking at it, this girl isn't Percy's firstborn. Though true that their council was completely unorthodox with its ruling and laws, they still held themselves to some standards reminiscent of past monarchies thanks to their tutoring with the past protogonoi. Even though they had two queens, everyone on the council still knew that Rhea was first lady in a sense and held that authority. Sure, on a personal and relationship level both Hestia and Rhea were equal in Percy's eyes, but in their court of law Hestia still differed to Rhea. Being that case, it was an unsaid fact that Rhea would carry Percy's firstborn, unless Percy made sure to get both queens pregnant on the same night and leave it up to who was born first. Knowing him, he just might actually, but the issue was that how this new child would be seen. Medusa knew neither Rhea nor Hestia would hold ill will or try to harm the girl, but that would do little for possible feelings of betrayal. Not to mention this girl could put Percy on the crosshairs depending on how he viewed her, which would undoubtedly be like a proper father. I see the problem, Medusa mumbled softly as some more thought as Andromeda nodded gravely. But I still think you should awaken her, and tell all three of them. What? Andy nearly shrieked as she looked at Medusa in shock. Are you crazy? But hiding it will only hurt in the long run, and besides, if you don't awaken her, what will you do? Medusa countered. Andy paused to try and find an argument, but Medusa didn't let her. She's already created and obviously alive. What? Are you going to lock her away forever? No. Andy snapped, but Medusa kept the pressure. Then are you going to kill her? Toss her in Styx's lake to make sure her essence is destroyed forever. Andromeda gasped in horror at even the idea while Medusa pointed at the girl. She's your daughter, so are you going to give her the chance to live or not? She asked heatedly. Andromeda remained silent for some time as Medusa continued to watch her, wondering where the goddess' thoughts were going at the moment. She didn't think Andy would actually consider disposing of her daughter in any shape or form, but then again the situation was rather precarious. Still, after nearly 5 minutes of silence, Andy sighed as her shoulders slumped. I don't know. Medusa pinched the bridge of her nose in irritation before forcing herself to calm down. It wouldn't do to go on shouting at the obviously distraught goddess. From what she could see, it would be cruel and unrealistic to ask Andy to get rid of the girl, but at the same time, if she did awaken the girl now of all times, the reactions would be the worst. That's it. Medusa snapped as she grabbed Andy's hand and started to drag her out of the room. She would have preferred to shadow travel them, but being in the office connected to the mind of a primordial, no form of teleportation would work unless one had express permission by said god. Where are we going? Andy asked, putting up little resistance even as they left the lab room with the slumbering immortal. To find Rhea and Hestia, Medusa answered, giving an extra tug as Andy suddenly pulled back in shock. Why? Andromeda asked in confusion as she slowly started to put some resistance, knowing that Medusa was nowhere near actually strong enough to pull Andy anywhere if the goddess didn't want to. Because you don't have the luxury to hide this and wait for a better time, Medusa said as they arrived again at the bottom floor before turning around to face the apparently confused goddess. Andromeda, we are declaring war in little more than 3 weeks. The Olympians have already noticed Ares being absent and are definitely starting to notice the shifts in power. Once Phoebe stops cloaking the mountain from their senses, they will send demigod and monster forces after us. We on the other hand do not have an army but a select group of warriors and their personal forces to fight this entire war. Warriors including you, me, and the majority of the council. The last thing we need is you basically driving yourself mad by denying yourself and then upsetting the queens too. We need to be united even if that means facing the music now. That broke whatever resistance Andy had been trying to dig up as the goddess bowed her head in acknowledgement. Medusa nodded as she continued to lead the goddess out of her office and they quickly arrived at the door leading out, but before they could they were startled by a sudden knocking. Were you expecting anyone? Medusa asked with a glance to Andy. No, she replied as she narrowed her eyes for a moment. But it's Jason. Without further ado the door swung open to reveal said god dressed in a white button shirt and faded jeans, his Dracon leather boots gleaming as if freshly polished. Medusa though noted a slightly hollow look in his eyes which made her frown marginally, though she remained quiet as the god stepped closer. He did a quick scan of the library before focusing on Andromeda. Hey Andy, he said softly before glancing to Medusa. Medusa. Jason, the pair replied together before quieting down to wait for what the primordial needed of them, or more specifically, Andromeda. So, he started as he ran his head through his hair. I was wondering if you could do a check for me before I head out for that mission. Medusa raised an eyebrow in curiosity before looking to Andy, but the goddess gave her a later look. Are you sure? Andy asked with clear concern even as she flagged down one of her birds. Yes, he replied with a slight slump to his shoulders. It needs to be done. You know as well as I do that the oceans are the only dangerous place for us right now. If we don't want this war to draw out for decades, then we need to destabilize Atlantis. But, of all the ways to do this, Andy started, but Jason interrupted. And this would get the results the fastest. Andromeda looked a little annoyed with him but pushed it off with a sigh as she took a new tablet from one of her birds. Medusa noted that this tablet had a gold marker meaning mystic, or godly, but what was strange about it was that the heart at the edge wasn't the more common pink or white or the rare gold as most of the other tablets. This one was a deep blue and most alarmingly had actual cracks running through the little heart. Then, as Andromeda tapped the screen to life, a name appeared which surprised Medusa as she leaned closer to see. Still heartbroken, Andromeda said with her own sad sigh before tapping the screen to make it go dark and handing it to her waiting bird. She'll be susceptible enough if you know how to behave, she added with a grimace of distaste that Jason mirrored before he nodded and turned around. As he started to walk he paused when Andy spoke up. Jason, why did you volunteer for this mission? Andy asked softly as the retreating god stiffened. He remained silent for a minute before he asked, tell me, what is Eos feeling for me right now? That made Andy frown but she still signaled to her birds nonetheless. In less than a minute she had another different tablet, also with golden markers and glowing red hearts. She tapped them to get a quick read and frowned before giving the tablet back and looking to Jason's back. Well, to put it bluntly, horny and wondering how to get you in her pants. Jason nodded without looking at them. I thought as much. He then continued walking and soon left the office, the sound of the door closing echoing throughout the tower. There was silence for several minutes before Medusa looked to Andy. What was that all about? I didn't know there were any other missions going on besides securing contacts with the Canadian and possibly British government and bringing in a few more of the stronger titans like Selene and Helios. It was part of the council discussion last night, Andromeda answered as she frowned at the door. Like Jason said, the oceans are dangerous for us right now. Poseidon has a full kingdom and army, not to mention that Oceanus wasn't caught again, and then there's them, she practically growled making Medusa flinch as the slight building of divine pressure around the goddess. Luckily she reined it in quickly but not before thoroughly reminding Medusa that though she was strong enough to fight gods, she still held no candle to any member of the council. But any kingdom will always have those discontent with the rulers over time, especially with the history of violent takeovers prevalent in our particular history. Jason simply volunteered to sow more seeds of doubt and mess up their sea court. So he's willingly going to find her and try to seduce her? Medusa asked incredulously. That wasn't at all like the Jason she'd come to know in the years spent training together. I wish he hadn't, but he might be one of the few who can. She's never personally met him so she won't recognize him plus, as much as it saddens me to say, he's one of the few that might be able to relate to her, Andy explained. Even after what Hemera said, he's still keeping his heart closed off to love and I'm guessing something went on with Eos that made it worse. But how could Eos make it worse? Medusa asked. I mean, she's so warm and bubbly and soothing, like the mornings. Andy snorted at the reference to that goddess domain before continuing. Yes, and I thought hanging out with her could help Jason and it was for a while but, well, it looked like she was more of a fangirl than genuinely interested. I hadn't really checked up until now but it was pretty obvious that she was feeling more lust than anything and Jason already had to deal with that during his hero years, especially after the wars. With his own heartbreak and then all that attention for the wrong reasons, I guess he's starting to give up hope on finding that special someone that wants him for him. Medusa remained silent at that, looking to the door as well, before sighing and then returning her attention to Andy. Okay, well it's his decision in the end and as long as he can live with it, we can't really comment. As for you, we still have two queens to speak to. Andromeda groaned but didn't put up a fight as Medusa continued to drag her on. She was not looking forward anymore to this conversation than the goddess was but it needed to be done soon, otherwise things might only get worse for Andromeda and then spill over to the council as well. D.A. Chapter 73, Doubts of the Heart IV. Rhea Pav. Rhea sat on her throne as she slowly tapped a finger on the armrest, her face giving away nothing as she looked down as Andromeda, still in mortal height, and the meek and quiet Medusa standing next to her in silent support. Rhea glanced to the equally stoic Hestia sitting on her throne off to the side with Percy's throne between them. As for the king himself, he was currently with Lupa and checking on something with his wolves in northern Norway. She'd listened silently as Andromeda had come to them with the egging on of Medusa to explain her plight to them. Whatever good mood she'd previously had for the day went up in smoke and now her throat felt dry as she contemplated her fellow goddess. Andromeda kept her head tilted down and barely dared to make any eye contact as she squirmed under their gaze. Right now it wasn't a friendly atmosphere. This wasn't Rhea and Hestia, two of the warmest and friendliest goddesses that gave a comforting presence with smiles and care, the ones anyone could approach for a friendly ear and support. This was Queen Rhea and Queen Hestia, firm rulers and fighters hardened in the flames of war and millennia of backstabbing politics. Queens capable of making hard decisions if needed, rulers willing to offer in equal parts mercy and safety to those truly deserving of it, or being the executioners to those beyond redemption. And right now, they were the wives that just had a goddess ask them to willingly allow their king and husband to cheat, going against his vows sworn to Styx and chaos herself. Rhea wasn't sure about Hestia, but her own initial reaction that she'd mercilessly stomped down when Andy explained what she wanted from Percy had been to snarl and put the goddess in her place. She didn't care at the moment that this was Andromeda, Percy's sister that she helped raised and loves, the girl that had helped them in their own romance. Right now she was feeling slightly hurt and almost betrayed that Andromeda had grown feelings for Percy, even if it really wasn't her fault. She was also angry at the suddenness of the situation. Why couldn't have Andromeda approached sooner and slowly brought up that she was growing feelings for Percy so that Rhea could have given it time and adjusted instead of suddenly all but barging in and passively pleading to sleep with Percy. She could feel how her jaw tightened at the thought as her eyes narrowed to slits. She knew she was both territorial and possessive, there was no denying that. It hadn't been easy coming to terms with knowing at first that she'd have to share Percy, and a large part of her willingness to share had been knowing that Percy had genuine feelings for Hestia beforehand even if he hadn't been aware. She would have never willingly harmed him by forcing him to choose, and even until Hestia had actually arrived, Rhea had her doubts about it all even if she wanted Percy to be happy. But now her temper was high and she was doing all she could to keep her nails from turning into gleaming claws capable of tearing apart even the toughest Drakon scales. She gave a side glance to Hestia, impressed with how calm the goddess looked even if Rhea could see the slightest wisps of steaming drifting off Hestia's head and shoulders. Deciding that she couldn't trust her voice at the moment, she sent a mental probe at Hestia to open a private conversation with her. It took merely a second before the communication was established. So, how are you feeling about this? She asked tightly even within her mind. Holding it in for now, was the response. I don't want to be angry with her, it's just. I know, I feel it too. But what do we tell her for now? Well, I'm certainly not going to just smile and say go ahead right now. In fact, I really want to say the opposite and not in a very nice way either, Hestia quipped back as she glanced to Rhea. So what? Send her away for the moment. It may be for the best, otherwise we might say or do something that we'll really regret. Not to mention it will hurt Percy if we do. Rhea mentally sighed before nodding and cutting the connection as she returned her full attention to Andromeda, noticing for the first time that the young goddess' eyes were getting watery as she still looked at the floor. Rhea knew Andromeda could feel the anger rolling off them and was probably assuming the worst, and Rhea wasn't sure if her assumption was unfounded at the moment. So she took a deep breath before speaking, her tone steady yet cold. I'll be honest, Andromeda, I'm not happy about this. I can't say yes. She raised a hand as Andromeda finally looked up at them, the hurt clearly in her eyes, but she remained silent. I'm not saying no either. Not at the moment anyways, but you've given us a lot to think about, so I think it's best that you give us some space for a while. She didn't say any more as Andromeda nodded weakly before slowly turning, whispering something to Medusa, and then flashing away back to their home above the planet. Medusa gave them a meek look before dissolving into shadows as well, leaving the queens alone for the time being. They remained quiet for a minute or two before Hestia waved her hand to erect a barrier locking in sound and from anyone entering the throne room. It wasn't by any means a barrier strong enough to stop any of the other council members from entering, but it did send the message, private conversation, loud and clear. It took another minute or so before Hestia broke the tense silence, and not in an expected way. She all but roared as she slammed her hand on her armrest as the flames in the hearth erupted like a geyser, turning the throne room into an oven, but Rhea didn't really care at the moment. She focused on keeping the earth steady lest she unleash all manner of earthquakes across the globe, even though she could feel a few active volcanoes getting more active. The hearth kept raging for a while as Rhea trained on her breathing, willing herself to calm down as Hestia finally started to settle as well. Looking at her sister wife now, Rhea noted how feral she looked with her newly gained fangs displayed in a vicious snarl, her crimson glowing eyes and steaming red tips of her hair, her dainty nails having elongated into scarlet talons with the slightest fringe of scales along her knuckles. Ray's own claws had finally come out in their golden glory, and she could feel how her hair had become wilder to resemble that of a mane. Between the two of us throwing a tantrum we could level most of human civilization, she thought darkly as they reined themselves in, Hestia looking as tired as Rhea suddenly felt. What are we going to do? Hestia asked softly after her draconic features had receded and the hearth had returned to normal. I don't know, Rhea replied as she looked at her lap. But we have to do something, not ignore this, Hestia continued as she got up and slowly started to pace the throne room. You heard it yourself. Her domains are acting up and it's starting to affect her. I know and I get that, it's just, Rhea stopped as she looked at Hestia. There is more to this than letting Percy cheat to sat Andromeda's needs. He wouldn't anyways, Hestia said. His loyalty is still his defining feature, even if he doesn't give it away like free candy anymore. And his sister needs him. She wouldn't be his sister if they went that way. Not to mention it isn't as easy or simple as it was with you and me being lovers as well as sister wives. You and I spent a grand total of 12 hours being mother and daughter. One when you were born, spar minutes in the rare times we met during the war, and even that was at a distance, another one or so after the war before the Titans were locked away, and that one dinner in the House of Night. It was weird at first, but we didn't have anything in the past to go on, Rhea cut in sharply. Percy and Andromeda on the other hand have decades being siblings, and unlike Andromeda, Percy isn't a love god capable of having his feelings shift like hers. And we don't know if he even feels like that towards her, so even if we allowed it, who's to say he would actually go through with it? But we know that Percy is always willing to help those that need him. Even if he doesn't feel like that towards her, he still would just to help her, Hestia retorted. Yes, and he would make himself guilty. You saw how serious he was with his vows to us, to remain faithful and caring. Even if we pushed him to do it, and that is a very big if, he would still berate himself for touching another woman, not to mention he was never the sort of guy to go with a one-night stand. But it wouldn't be a one-night stand, Hestia replied as she paused to look at the hearth. All of us need to connect with our domains and give in fully at least once to all the emotions and concepts connected to them, but being separated from our domains can be just as bad. Yes, and I don't know whether that makes it better or worse, Rhea said as she rubbed her temple. There's something more about this bothering you, isn't there? Hestia suddenly asked, making Rhea snap her head up to look at her. You got too angry, too quickly. I saw how you almost lashed out within minutes of Andromeda asking to be with Percy before she explained why. So, what's bothering you in particular? Rhea held her gaze for a while as she thought about it. Sure, it was millennia in the past, but it would seem that it was relevant again. She sighed before nodding and then beginning to explain. I once dealt with similar things back in my tenure as Queen of the Titans. First of all, I was given like some damn prize to Kronos by my mother. And now both have faded, Hestia quipped with a predatory smirk which Rhea mirrored. Thankfully, but at the time, I tried to appease mother and make do with it. However, because of that I was basically docile and submissive all the time, which lead to several issues. Hestia raised an eyebrow before motioning for Rhea to go on. Kronos was a controlling and jealous ass. He felt entitled to me and wouldn't allow me to even get close to other men on friendly means, however he only really paid attention in his bouts of jealousy, otherwise he was content to have me home while I knew he was off betting whatever slut opened up for him just because he was king. Rhea took a pause to collect herself and retract her claws as the memories surfaced. It hurt, knowing I was doing so much for him only to be tossed aside like that, but I tried to tolerate it. However, what really started to piss me off was that some of those women actually had the nerve to parade the fact that my husband preferred their company to mine. Even if I wasn't egotistical, it still hurt to know I was a laughing stock that couldn't keep her own husband in her bed, that I wasn't even properly respected beyond being cordial on important events while tolerating every backhanded insult sent my way, she growled as she got up and started pacing. Even got to the point that I actually snapped and nearly beat to death one goddess. She certainly wasn't receiving compliments on her beauty again, she added darkly. But now it might just start again. What do you mean? Hestia asked with a tilt of the head. Rhea sighed while running a hand through her hair. What I mean is that you, me, the council, what we do has more significance than just our laws and maintaining our domains. We may not like it, but we are also keyed into the politics of the mystic world now and soon the mortal world. We have to maintain certain stances and behavior from now on, otherwise we might appear weak. Noting Hestia's frown, Rhea continued on while looking her sister wife in the eyes. Let's be realistic here. We didn't create Mount Cartier and this city from the pure goodness of our hearts, and every single resident of the city should know that. It is a power move, a declaration, and a foothold for what comes next. The same is not all the gods coming here or because they believe in us or for a utopia. They saw the play at hand and followed along for their own reasons, whether it was safety, a chance to increase their own position, or a thirst to watch Olympus burn. Regardless, they are just as many selfish reasons as there are altruistic, and at the center of it all is the council. We rule by example, and if that means being cold and ruthless if the situation demands it, then so be it. Rhea paused as she sat back down on her throne and fixed Hestia with a hard look. So what happens if we draw back and allow Andromeda what she wants? What's to stop other goddess, and you know there are several, from trying as well? And what's worse is that we would have to tolerate the behavior as long as they don't actually do anything, unless we want to make ourselves out to being jealous bitches. But it would be known why Percy had to do it, Hestia interjected, only for Rhea to shake her head. It wouldn't matter. Gods can be just as flawed and selfish as any mortal. Remember, give an inch, they take a mile. It would send a message that we aren't equal to our king, that we are simply his, and he is free to do as he wishes. Even with the reasons, it would paint us in the same light as Zeus, Hera, and Aphrodite. The king taking what he wants, the queens in this case being forced to bear with it in resignation, and the slut using her domain as an excuse to bed whoever she wants. Rhea raised her hand to stop Hestia from interrupting. It doesn't matter if that isn't the truth, gods are petty and they will gossip just to entertain themselves. Why do you think Percy had been planning with Nyx for decades how to keep the gods busy rather than letting them be a population of lazy, overpowered and overfunded college students running around and causing havoc with their terrible birth control? We hate it, but the fact of the matter is that appearance matters now. And accepting Andromeda will have consequences beyond just her relationship with Percy, Hestia agreed as she actually sat of Percy's throne to sit next to Rhea. They both felt Percy's consciousness pass over them to check before leaving again, knowing he was fine with them sitting on his throne from time to time. Yes, and we have to consider if those consequences are worth it or not, Rhea replied as both sat in silence, stewing in their own thoughts. They were silent for several minutes until Hestia took Rhea's hand to get her attention, and once Rhea was looking, Hestia began. What if we make it another power play? She asked with an odd glint in her eyes. Such as? Rhea asked with a small frown. Well, letting Andromeda sleep with Percy on a regular basis would undermine our authority and could also weigh Percy down with guilt, right? Rhea nodded as she waited for Hestia to get on with it. But what if we also had a similar deal? Are you asking to get your own lover? Rhea asked in mix of shock and horror. You would actually consider letting another man touch you? Of course not. Hestia snapped back with obvious anger over Rhea even considering she would do such a thing. I'll happily scream that I'm Percy's, no one else. She then took a moment to collect herself while still glaring slightly at Rhea. However, after our first night, things changed between us. We aren't just married to Percy but each other as well, Hestia continued with a faint, silvery blush at the end as she squeezed Rhea's hand affectionately. Rhea relaxed and smiled at that, even going as far as leaning forward and giving Hestia a small kiss that was gently returned for a few seconds before breaking apart. It had honestly been an in-the-moment decision to kiss Hestia during that night, mostly to tease Percy, but after Hestia had taken charge along with Percy, Rhea had been more than happy to opening up their relationship to be an honest three-way. A slightly embarrassing conversation and morning sex had settled it, and Rhea can honestly say the three had never been happier. It practically eliminated any jealousy over who got more time with Percy and allowed all of them to truly bond to each other. Okay, Rhea said in a pleased sigh as some of her earlier tension dissolved with the kiss. So what do you mean with a similar deal? Well, if we look at it from an honest standpoint, Percy is the only one that is strictly straight, Hestia explained, getting Rhea to snort. We could just turn ourselves into the opposite gender and let Percy get a feel for being on the receiving end, she joked, though she might just bring up the idea sometime just to see. Huh, was Hestia's reply, even if Rhea could tell she was thinking about it judging by the growing blush. Anyways, I doubt that would mean he would want anyone other than us, but that aside, Percy's straight and we're not. So, who's to say he should be the only one to enjoy the perks of sleeping with another goddess? Are you suggesting we join in on these sessions? Rhea asked with a raised eyebrow, to which Hestia nodded before raised her finger. Think about it, if anything, Percy is fair. He doesn't like having things handed to him, especially if he doesn't feel he earned it. Not that I would ever even dream of asking him to, but if we wanted to be allowed to sleep with other men just because he can with other women, then he would. He would hate it, but he would tolerate it if we demanded it. However, what's to say that we can't simply be part of this? I can't believe it, Rhea murmured in near awe. To think I managed to corrupt you so quickly, I made Nyx proud. She squealed while wiping away a non-existent tear, getting slap on the shoulder from Hestia. Okay, Miss Shameless, but on a more serious note, Hestia continued as Rhea chuckled slightly. Like you said, the image is important and we would have to find a way to stop from being undermined and having any old hussy trying to get our man, so why not make it so it's not Percy's lover but our lover? So making Andromeda a concubine? Rhea asked with a slight bit of distaste. That might not go over so well and it might still put Andromeda in a bad light. Not to stereotype her, but she is a love goddess. I might not have liked Aphrodite, but I was around enough to hear about how gods with the love domain are rarely limited to one sexual preference. And it would be her decision too, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't find her attractive. But we'd also still have to go back and convince Percy about this whole thing, and in this scenario, his fidelity isn't working with us, not to mention our vows, Rhea pointed out. Well, we could go to Styx and even contact Lady Chaos to adjust our vows enough to allow only someone approved by all three of us to be our lovers. Lovers. As in plural? Rhea asked with narrowed eyes. We both know that there are some others that genuinely love Percy like us, Hestia replied with a sigh. It would be at least fair to offer the option to some of them rather than let some get resentful. Oh Chaos, look at us, 1 minute considering murder and now we are planning to form a harem of all things for ourselves and our husband, she moaned as she rubbed her temple. It really does seem that Percy has the shittiest luck and the luck of the devil at times, Hestia giggled. At least we know he'd be able to handle multiple women, Rhea purred as she recalled Percy's behavior during their first night in their new house. The predatory glint in his eyes and how he radiated dominance as he held her down and took her. A delicious shudder ran up her spine just at the memory, and the morning after when Percy was on top of Hestia and truly showed the draconic goddess who was truly the one in control. Gods, I might just jump him next time I see him, she thought as she eyed Hestia and wondered if she could get away with a quickie before any of the others in the council returned from wherever they were. We should meet up with Percy, Hestia said, snapping Rhea out of her perverted train of thought. Hestia waved her hand to disperse the barrier much to Ray's chagrin, but before she could comment on her little plan they both noticed Nico walking in looking oddly pale. Odd considering his normal pale was more of an otherworldly glow, now he just plain looked Sawaghost pale, as ironic as that was. Nico? Hestia asked, making the demi-primordial start as if he hadn't noticed their presence before. How he didn't see 200-foot goddesses was beyond Rhea. Oh, hey Hestia, Rhea, he said absent-mindedly as he looked to Andromeda's throne and frowned at the apparent lack of said goddess. By the way, do you girls know where Andy is? Rhea and Hestia shared a glance before looking back to the air of the pit. She's busy at the moment. Why? Did you need something? Ah, well, Nico muttered as he shuffled his feet and getting the goddesses more curious by the second. Well, it's just, I needed Andy advice on something. And that would be? Hestia asked as she leaned forward. You could just ask us to see if we could help. Nico remained silent for a few minutes while he opened and closed his hands, muttering to himself. He then finally turned his head up to look at them. I need some advice because, he paused as he took a deep breath, getting Hestia and Rhea at the edge of their seats in anticipation. Styx proposed to me. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. What? D.A. Chapter 74, Making Choices I. Nico flinched as his ears were assaulted by the combined voices of his queens, both looking at him as if he'd grown a second head. He couldn't really blame them seeing as how freaking random the whole thing was. Still, after giving a mild glare while making a point to rub his ringing ears, both goddesses settled down with the grace to look slightly embarrassed though Hestia reached down and placed her open palm before him. The invitation being clear, he made a quick hop onto her hand before she lifted him up to their eye level. Sorry, Hestia said in a softer voice, knowing that their size made any tone above inside voice painful for anyone of regular size. So, mind repeating that? Rhea asked next as she leaned over the armrest of her throne to get closer. He sighed with a nod. Yeah, so Styx proposed to me. Why? Hestia asked next as she narrowed her eyes slightly. She does know that you don't swing that way, right? Not like I hide it, Nico defended while resisting from crossing his arms petulantly. Rhea and Hestia shared a glance before Rhea asked, so, how exactly did it go? He almost groaned at their obvious curiosity and need to settle their confusion. Hell, he was still confused. Regardless, he told them. The night before after their meeting. As the council members used their favored forms of teleportation, the king and his queens quickly dissolving into shadows and likely heading up to their home. Jason going off to possibly hunt down his new target, and Talia leaving to finally meet with Aeolus, and two of the cardinal winds leaving the west wind to still be found. Phoebe went to likely Delos as she still favored the island, and lastly Andromeda returning to her office for her project. As Nico walked down his long flight of stairs to reach the throne room floor, he noted that Styx was looking directly at him. He didn't find it odd considering she'd been glancing at him repeatedly for some time. He'd admit that it got him curious, but he'd left her to approach at her own leisure. Now though, as he got to the floor, she got up from her throne and slowly walked to him, shrinking with every step. As she walked, he couldn't help but admire her. Sure, he was firmly in the rainbow camp, but it didn't mean that he couldn't appreciate feminine beauty, and being in a council with arguably the most beautiful women on the planet tended to draw his gaze. Rhea, the epitome of a queen with a regal stature and grace. Her body being the perfect, curvy balance of athletic performance and natural beauty, giving homage to her domain of nature and the ideal of a physically perfect woman. Hestia, the embodiment of fire, making her a hot goddess mixed with her demure and gentle personality that could melt even the coldest hearts. Then there was Talia, unyielding and fierce like her storm domain. She carried a sense of danger and slight haughtiness that made her the center of attention without even trying. Andromeda, in contrast to Rhea being nature's ideal, took on the ideal of what sentient beings, predominantly humans, wanted or unconsciously looked for. The curviest of the council, her every motion and stance screaming sensuality, her voice sweeter than honey even on a bad day. It was at those times Nico thanked Chaos Andy's personality wasn't anything like Aphrodite, otherwise even he would be putty in the goddess' hands. Next came Phoebe, whose domains culminated into the strands of fate, who carried a natural allure to herself. Phoebe was not the most beautiful of the council, or the curviest, or fiercest, but with her there was a supernatural and exotic appeal. A sense of mystery, an ocean of unasked questions and hints around her, that mocha skin contrasting her glowing amber eyes that simply drew you in with the need to know. And lastly was Styx, the most quirky of the lovely ladies of the council. Usually teasing, bordering flirty with any and all to the point she kept a tally of how many gods and goddesses alike she could make blush throughout the day. Being a more petite beauty, Nico would usually describe the goddess as impish with her slim build and thin waist, modest bust and proportionally long legs leading to one of the tightest rears he'd ever seen. Big doe eyes holding unusually sharp tones of venom green and onyx black in equal swirls, her long green and black streaked hair that always looked like she'd just showered barely a minute ago. If he was being honest with himself, he found her more attractive than the other goddess. Maybe it was her playful personality, even though he could literally feel the darker aura hidden underneath thanks to her domain of hatred that was so similar to his own as the air of the pit. Maybe it was that since he liked guys he really couldn't appreciate the soft, marshmallow goodness of big boobs. It was a coin toss really. Still, whatever the reason, his eyes still watched as Styx slowly walked towards him, his eyes catching the slight sway of her hips shown by her snug chitin. She didn't stop until she was only a few feet away at best, now looking up at their difference in height. They waited in silence, or at least Nico waited, considering it was Styx that approached him since she obviously had something to tell him. However, she looked unusually nervous given by the slight shuffle of one of her feet and her hesitant glances. Odd, since when is Styx ever shy about anything? He wondered before deciding to break the silence himself. So Styx, he started, already berating himself for sounding so bland. Can I help you with something? Ah well, she started, the momentary flash of relief passing her eyes thanks to him speaking first. I just wanted to ask you something. Another odd pause ensued until Nico cleared his throat. Okay, shoot, he said casually, trying to make the atmosphere a little more comfortable. Styx fidgeted with the rope tied around her waist. How are things with you and Will? That got him to start, not expecting that question in the slightest. Generally the others that have known him the longest simply talk to him in general and only going on to the subject of Nico's love life if Nico brought it up himself. Ah, good. We're good. He just started his resignations from the practice in New York and will be ready to move here within the week. He's over the moon since his focus was split between athletic traumas and child care thanks to being the resident doctor in the camp so long. I'm sure Leto will appreciate having such a friendly doctor on call, he answered, getting a small smile from her. And are you going to give him an apple? She asked softly. Nico blinked for a moment in thought. He'd already broached the subject with Will in terms to their mortality. Nico was already partially immortal and he honestly didn't want to watch Will retain mortality and age on until passing. But he knew Will did have some reservations about immortality, partially in his respect to fair play and feeling like it was being given away rather than earned. Another being that immortals tended to have really loose pants, as so eloquently portrayed by their extensive family tree. Nico knew Will was scared of potentially growing into something similar to Apollo, even though Nico highly doubted it, and then Will would always answer in an oddly pessimistic way. Sure, maybe not now or even in a century. But that's immortality. There will always be enough time to change and possibly make that mistake. But Nico could understand his worries. It was the same reasons Percy had constantly rejected the Olympians and their demand of him joining them. He didn't want to become separated and distant from the very mortals he grew up with and spilled blood protecting, fearing that immortality would change him. Still, shaking his head of the thoughts, he refocused on Styx. Yeah, I was thinking of giving him an apple soon after he gets here. I would rather be assured that he'll be okay on the battlefield since I know he'll want to fight too, and I don't know if I could handle him dying. At least as an immortal, if he gets taken out, I'll wait a few decades for him to reform in Tartarus. Styx nodded at his answer before asking, and have either of you thought of marriage? That got Nico to blush slightly before giving a hesitant shrug. I know that it's on his mind since I found some hints. You found the ring and questioned him about it, but he couldn't lie to save his life, she interrupted with a grin, to which he gave a defeated sigh and nodded. Yeah, but I could tell he wanted to do it at his own pace, so I dropped it for now. Styx hummed at that and looked towards the warm hearth for a while as Nico glanced at her again, noting how the flames seemed to reflect in her intense eyes. What about you? He suddenly asked, making her give him a side glance. Have you considered marriage to anyone? Styx returned her eyes to the fire before answering, her voice surprisingly stern. I have actually, but I find myself a little hesitant about the whole thing. Why? He asked curiously as he shifted around to be standing right beside her. Mostly due to some personal quirks and preference. After all, it's no secret that I simply love flirting for the sake of flirting, even to the point I risked getting mauled by Rhea one time by getting a little close with Percy during a training session, she said with a grin. Pretty ballsy, I'll give you that, he agreed, knowing that Percy and Rhea were equally territorial of each other and given Hestia's actions lately, the fiery goddess was as well. Yep, but that's just it. I like flirting, but that doesn't mean I'm really interested in doing much more. Sure, there have been a few lovely specimens from time to time that give me that special itch, but more often than not, I'm just not interested. So then why bother looking into it? He asked. If marriage is too much of a hassle, then don't marry, and if you get that itch once in a blue moon, then find that lucky guy or lady, and scratch it. That's just it though, I don't want to sleep with just anybody, she said with a sigh. I do want to have that special someone and have love, but even then, I'm just not a sexual creature like our king and queens, she added with a snicker, and he snorted in agreement. DA. Chapter 75. Making Choices 2. That's just it though, I don't want to sleep with just anybody, she said with a sigh. I do want to have that special someone and have love, but even then, I'm just not a sexual creature like our king and queens, she added with a snicker, and he snorted in agreement. Everyone knew that Percy and Rhea were both stamina monsters on the battlefield, and it obviously translated into bedroom activities. He wasn't sure if he was more impressed with the fact that Percy's appetite was more than enough to screw both his wives into orgasmic puddles, or that it took Hestia barely a few days to match up to them from the get-go. Both continued to snicker for a moment before Styx cleared her throat and continued. Anyways, the point is that if I did have a husband, I wouldn't really be able to meet the physical needs often enough, and that would be more of a punishment than anything else to whoever that is. What if you tweak your vows so that he could find release somewhere else? He asked, to which she frowned. I don't like the idea of being cheated on, even if it's for a reason, she replied curtly before sighing. Nico scrunched his brows for a moment in thought, wondering how to get around Styx's quirks to find a working relationship. Obviously it would have to be someone that had interest in her just as she him her, but at the same time, it couldn't be someone wanting more activity that spare times, but then again, immortals rarely had low libidos. Then again, it would also need to be someone capable of dealing with Styx's teasing personality. What about a poly relationship like Percy, Rhea, and Hestia? He asked, getting Styx to look at him curiously. You could marry two people in that way, they could satisfy each other. But who? She asked as she suddenly turned towards him, her eyes seeming to glow as she zeroed in on him. How many couples are out there that are willing to open up to a third? What's to say that I'll even like one, let alone both of them as is? And what if they marry just for the prestige of being married to a council member, or maybe they're mortal and want to be immortal as well? With each question, Styx took a step towards him, and Nico couldn't help but take a step back to mirror it. Her every light step sounded like a hammer fall to his ears, the slight sway of her hips like a hypnotic pendulum to his eyes. He stood nearly a foot taller and broader, his frame a testament to being hardened in the flames of war, his black and red tinged eyes normally pinning others to the spot as he observed them. Yet for all that, he felt the smaller of the two and could only back away and yield as Styx came forward. Then suddenly he stumbled and couldn't stop himself from falling back on his rear. He only got a moment to sit up before his heart leapt into his throat as Styx sat on him, straddling him as her eyes bored into his. His body suddenly felt like ice, with only the parts making contact with her burning, especially her hands pressed against his chest. You know, she said softly, even as her eyes retained their steely semblance. Of all the men I've spotted from the rare times I came to the surface when I could, none have ever given me the itch, like you have, Nico D'Angelo. Her hands started to slide down as she wiggled ever so slightly to get more comfortable, and Nico found a strange though not unpleasant heat over his crotch. He tried to ignore it though as he refocused on her face, his hands getting clammy and throat dry at her little confession. I know you are very much in love with Will, and I would love to be there for your vows someday, however, I can't help but wonder. She then leaned a little closer, her breath washing over his face and her body seeming to press down on him more. With your suggestion and all, if you two would be willing to consider me. His eyes widened as he looked at her heart-shaped face, glancing at the little dainty lips speaking such dangerous words. And I can't help but feel that you aren't against feminine delights, as much as you say, she almost teased as she slowly rolled her hips, making him groan before he suddenly looked down in alarm. He wasn't a stranger to female teasing and even some touching, what with the more daring girls in his years after the war trying to seduce him along with the few openly gay men. Hell, the old heroes once threw a party to try and get over some of the sadder feelings of the previous years thanks to Percy's disappearance. Most got roaring drunk and started a raunchy truth or dare game that got some interesting results. Will ended up making out with a broom. Jason and Frank shared a kiss. Nico's idea. He just didn't think they'd do it. Calypso took Leo to a closet and forgot to come back out. Somehow Hazel and Piper ended up cuddling topless, and of all things, Raina gave Nico a lap dance. It was then that she showed the kind of movement and flexibility one would expect from a child of Aphrodite could have, along with Nico gaining some appreciation for the softness of a female's rump, but even then he still didn't bat an eye. He'd never reacted to a girl more than maybe a second glance and remaining at a distance, but Styx was making him react right now. The goddess even went as far as giving him a little smirk of victory before she backed her face up while Nico was still mentally reeling. Now that we know that it wouldn't just be a token marriage given that there is attraction between us, she said as she gazed down while intentionally wriggling again, but this time he bit back the groan and desire to grab her hips. I was wondering if you'd like to marry me, Nico D'Angelo. He was gapping like a fish as he looked at her, too stunned with everything that happened in the last 5 minutes to form a coherent thought. She was proposing to him. What about Will? Wait, but she meant a pair, so him and Will. But would Will even? Styx giggled, breaking his train of thought as she looked down at him, her eyes shining with a familiar mirth. I don't expect an answer right now, she said as she leaned closer again. I know this is sudden and we don't really have feelings for each other. Well, I might have what's considered a crush, she admitted with a light blush. But still, just think about it and talk to Will. Who knows, maybe this will turn out better than either of us could have guessed. With that, she gave him his last flirty wink, a kiss on the cheek, and disappeared in a ball of green mist. Nico stared at the previously occupied space before glancing down at the bugle in his leather pants. Traitor, he growled at his offending organ before slumping back down and looking at the throne room ceiling currently mirroring the open night sky. He sighed, wondering just what was he going to do about all this. Present. And I just kinda stayed like that for the night and day, he finished, sitting cross-legged on Hestia's palm while said goddess and Rhea picked their mouths off the floor. Wow, Hestia murmured. Go Styx. Rhea snorted in amusement before focusing her eyes on Nico. So, have you come to any decision at all? Nico blinked at her for a moment before sighing while slumping his shoulders. I don't know, that's why I wanted to ask Andy. Both goddesses hummed in thought while exchanging glances. All the while Nico looked between the pair before asking softly, how is it that you three came to your decision? Well, Rhea started hesitantly. It's complicated. I mean, me and Percy were already together and Andy tipped me off about his feelings for Hestia. If I hadn't known, I can guarantee that it would have taken a lot longer before I would have agreed to try being polyamorous. In the end, my love for him and willingness to compromise at first was what helped, but we also had years to truly adjust to the idea before Hestia came into the picture. Even then it didn't really sink in until Hestia was with us. And we all know how I reacted initially. Hestia chimed in with an embarrassed blush that lessened when Rhea tugged her free hand and gave it an affectionate kiss on the knuckles. Nico couldn't help but smile at that, even if he wasn't really a romantic himself. Really, his king and queens were the idols of a caring and honest relationship. Hestia sent Rhea a warm smile before returning to Nico. Anyways, in the end Andy helped me too and I realized my feelings hadn't changed even knowing Percy wouldn't only be mine but I compromised too. Heck, now it's an honest three-way marriage rather than two wives splitting a husband and I wouldn't change that for all the world. But could Will and I do that? He asked. It has to be a mutual decision and then if so, what would our dynamic be? Obviously I'm gay and apparently bi when Styx is around much to my humiliation, he said while pointedly ignoring the snickers from the goddesses. That's not to say that we'll have the same inclination. His dad is the god of bachelors, Rhea said with an eye roll. I'm pretty sure that if it came down to it he could scrounge up a little willingness to mount our apparent vixen of a river goddess. So crass, Nico said sarcastically but the goddess only stuck her tongue out at him. Besides, think of all the kinky scenarios, Hestia added innocently getting a genuinely shocked look from Nico. Where the hell did the proper and shy maiden go? Anyways, Rhea interjected. I think it's best that you go and talk to Will about it. Things won't go anywhere if you don't discuss it first and it will give him a few days to stew on it before arriving. Might want to hurry in case Styx decides to test if she can get a reaction out of Will too, Hestia commented making Nico jump in her palm. Now I'm worried, he snarked as he prepared to jump off her palm but before that he asked them, so what are you two doing now? I noticed the barrier but I didn't know if you two wanted to talk about it. Rhea and Hestia shared another glance before Rhea answered. We have a few apparent complications to our love life that needs addressing too. We're keeping it a little private for now, but we'll let you and the council know later on. Besides, right now I think we're going to find Percy and drag him to the House of Night for a little connection, Hestia added, her voice purring out the last word with such heat that even Nico had to blush. Sweet chaos, let Percy survive this night, Nico prayed as he noted Ray's saucy smirk, her fangs poking out of her lips. He gave an awkward nod and salute before hopping off Hestia's palm and disappearing into the hearth with a slight burst of purple flames within the wreaths of golden and orange fire. D.A. Chapter 76, Making Choices 3. Talia Pav. Talia was pissed. Oh sure, near all-powerful primordial goddess with domain of sky and storms. Capable of firing blots with more kick than that bastard's master stick without tiring in the slightest, taught by Nyx and the past council in everything from politics and war to home economics of all things, and if she wanted to be a little vain, a smoking hot body putting almost all other goddesses save for fellow members of the council to shame. Her own palace and servants at her beck and call, all the time in the world, and best of all, no more stupid oath of chastity. Granted, the last benefit was in a tricky spot at the moment. However, now she wasn't just a warrior getting to run around in the woods, hunt and fight to her heart's content, and basically be a bit of a crass bitch when the mood suited her. Now she was a council member, a political representative and power with scary levels of authority. Damn shame that power, especially in the political and social sense, came with baggage and leashes. That meant that she couldn't break her foot off in Aeolus' ass as the pompous twat droned on, trying to weasel some benefits and deals for his neutrality or possibly moving to Mount Cartier. No thanks. Last thing she needed was to castrate him if he tried to put the moves on her again at home. I don't see why we need him anyways, she growled as she flashed to the House of Primordials and started walking up the steps to their villa. It's not like he's even a heavy hitter and any storm spirits he releases can be tied down between me and Jason. She scoffed as she mindlessly kicked her feet, unconsciously willing her storm boots to dissolve into anklets of crackling electricity and her clothes changing from a semi-formal chiton reaching past her knees and braided hair into a snug tank shirt and short shorts with her hair in a loose ponytail. Stupid, smug, spineless wind god, she muttered as she moved to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of chilled nectar from the fridge rather than snapping her fingers and willing it into existence. She didn't really need to eat anymore, but the familiar sensation calmed her down as the liquid energy settled into her stomach. She hummed as she glanced around the kitchen, wondering if she would cook regular food or just grab some ambrosia from the fridge as well, but in the end shrugged and left towards the living room. As she walked, she focused back on the planet and noticed that several of the protogonoi weren't on the surface at the moment. She could only feel Jason in Florida, Styx and Phoebe in their mountain, and Nico in New York. Wondering where Percy and his ladies are. She mused, pointedly ignoring a small and familiar pang in her chest every time she thought about it. Damn feeling had been an annoying itch for the last 2 years, surface time. She arrived at the living room and was about to lay back on large sofa and possibly turn on the TV when she caught some sniffling. She glanced around until noticing that the patio doors were open and just beyond Andromeda was sitting at the pool edge with her back to Talia. She could also see the slight shake of her shoulders and caught another sniffle making her frown before she approached slowly. Andromeda seemed to be so out of it that she hardly noticed Talia getting closer. Andy. Talia started after getting just within a few feet, making Andy jump with a gasp. She glanced back for a moment but then hastily turned her face away and rubbed at her eyes. Sadly for Andy, Talia had clearly seen her puffy eyes and tear streaks. Andy, what's wrong? She asked tenderly, waiting as the goddess finally, slowly, turned to face her again. Nothing, she mumbled. Talia didn't even validate that crummy lie with a response. She merely sighed as she got a little closer and sat beside Andy and let her feet sink into the pool as well with mild amusement as Andy gasped from the low voltage introduced to the water from Talia's anklets. Finally settled, she turned her face and stared at Andy in the eyes, silently demanding a proper answer this time. The love goddess seemed oddly defensive for a minute or two before sighing in defeat, her lips barely forming into a pout. I'm sort of in trouble and might have made things worse, she said cryptically. With who and for what? Talia continued. Andromeda glanced down at her lap hesitantly for a moment before taking a deep breath and answering. Suddenly it seemed as if some dam had broken and everything just came spilling out, at one point through sobs, at other times with Andy making the biggest goo-goo eyes Talia had ever seen when she mentioned how she felt about Percy. It took a good hour or so, thanks to Talia interrupting several times with questions for clarifications. Who knew love and desire were such complicated domains? Talia always thought it just involved diving into every pair of pants and panties within sight given how Aphrodite behaved. Damn, even after years without Artemis I still get a bitter taste whenever I think of that damn whore, Talia thought with a grimace as Andromeda finally tapered off. So let me get this straight, Talia said after a full minute of silence. You love Percy, she said, avoiding using names and possibly drawing his attention, but in the romantic way. A shy nod. And not only that, but of all things the very core of your love domain is honed in on him, as are all your domains. Now because of that you won't even stand the thought of being with anyone else. Another firmer nod. And holding back is starting to hurt you, but when you told our queens, they didn't take it too well. All things considered I think they took it extremely well, Andy muttered as she looked at the stars beyond their little floating island. But I don't know if they'll be willing, or if Percy even feels that way about me. Talia snorted slightly, drawing the other goddess gaze before saying, are you sure you can't just wait it out and move on? I mean, is it really that bad, or maybe you haven't found Mr. Right? Andromeda gaped at her, in apparent shocked silence. Why you think this is just a passing thing? Just a habit I can break? She asked in an oddly cold voice, making Talia get the feeling that she might have said the wrong thing. Andromeda suddenly stood up, glaring sharply at Talia. I see that, Huntress, teachings are still ingrained in you. Well, news flash, I'm not that sham of a love goddess, and this isn't some passing thing. I love him, I always have, and it took my own powers acting up for me to realize it. And then what? Talia asked back, falling back on her usual stubbornness and familiar distrust of love deities in general. They just always seemed to cause all manner of discord around them, and now the council was getting some of that drama barely a month in after being formed. Who's to say that you won't have your love shift again, then you'll just. Whatever she was going to say was cut off as she jumped back, narrowly avoiding the fist that plowed into the marble she'd just been sitting on. She landed in a crouch and looked to see Andromeda's fist buried past the wrist in the miniature crater at the pool edge, the goddess giving Talia a piercing glare. Let's get something clear, Andromeda said in a dangerous tone that immediately reminded Talia of Percy during the rare times he was really pissed off. Just because I can love multiple people doesn't mean I can't be faithful or only stay with one person. Being a love goddess means I can adjust, but once my feelings cement and are returned, they don't change. I don't love him because of my domain, it just means that I can't lie to myself and deny it like some others. She nearly spit the last words venomously while narrowing her eyes at Talia. She then slowly got up with her fist still clenched. Don't you dare call my feelings a bluff or a phase, she practically snarled before beginning to walk past Talia and back into the villa. And by the way, maybe you should rethink why exactly you joined the hunt in the first place. Then she was gone, leaving Talia confused as she narrowed her eyes. What the hell did she mean by that? Everyone knew she joined to avoid the damn prophecy, even if it did leave her feeling guilty about dumping it all on Percy's shoulders. She'd have liked to be there for him and offer support, but then again he already had Annabeth at the time. And then he upped and disappeared without telling her, and it hurt knowing he just left rather than being taken against his will or something. Only for them to be reunited and surprise. Another gorgeous woman on his arm. At least he had succeeded and was happy now, and so was she, right? D.A. Chapter 77. Making Choices IV. Jason Pav. The music was blaring into his ears as the strobe lights flashed across his face, his sky-blue eyes reflecting the glow ominously from time to time. He watched as club-goers moved back and forth, bodies rolling and grinding to the music. The smell of perfume and alcohol tinged with sweat filling the atmosphere. For his part, Jason remained near the borders of the dance floor, a mortal tequila in hand as he rested coolly against a rail leading down the few steps into the dance floor proper. His lips in a flat line as he took a sip, ignoring the obvious batted eyelashes and coy invitations for him to join into the dancing. Beauties of all sorts, from natural blondes and brunettes to exotic dyes of pink and neon blue, from the palest creamy skins down to the richest pigments of cocoa, he caught the gaze of all, whether coming here alone or with a significant other. He scoffed at those though, having no personal interest in those spoken for, even if the hypocrisy was not lost on him in his current pursuit. Why was it that I volunteered for this again? He wondered to himself as he looked to the DJ booth, watching the skinny man as he bounced to the music, his hands in the air. Oh yeah, because it wouldn't work with anyone else, he answered himself with a bitter chuckle. Of the council members that were single, he was the only male, and his target was confirmed to strictly be into the male form. That in his face wasn't personally known to the goddess, making things easier. He sighed again as he returned to his drink when he felt a pair of slender arms slowly wrap around his waist along with the scent of morning dew near the beach soothing him. He might not have liked his mission, but he still couldn't keep the faint smile of his face as he partially turned to look down at her smiling face. The mortals around them saw her as a beauty befitting of a sailor's dreams. Heart-shaped face, small nose, bright sea-green eyes, and plump lips, all on a creamy skin and framed by waves of luscious dark hair reaching her back. He could see past it all, though, the mist being little more than a thin veil he could dispel with a thought to see her exotic beauty for what it was. Her creamy skin gaining a slightly green hue, her chin and cheeks sharpening as teeth coming to fine points peeked out through her soft smile. Her hair darkening and carrying occasional streaks of dark blue. With her short blue dress generously hugging her every curve and displaying long and toned legs, he wasn't sure how the sea god could keep his hands off her. Much to his amusement, she'd named herself Amphora on his introduction. He knew she could tell he was far from a regular mortal but hadn't commented on it, possibly turning a blind eye to it in favor of trying to enjoy the night. She'd only asked for his name and to play her game. He'd gone with James, only a few letters away from his real name. "Did you wait long?" she asked in a silky voice as she glanced at his drink. "Not at all," he replied easily as he turned in her arms and used his free one to wrap around her. She glanced down at his arm, the briefest moment on uncertainty flashing in her eyes before she hid it and smiled up at him coyly. "Are you thinking of heading back to the dance floor?" she asked as she pressed herself a little closer, ignoring every jealous look directed at her, much like how he ignored the male population of the club. I was thinking about it," he lied as he set down his finished drink on a nearby table before using his freed hand to cup her chin while his arm tightened until she was pulled flush against him, even going as far giving a slight gasp at his boldness. "But I think I had my fill of just dancing." There was a challenge in his eyes, a daring sort of danger that was enforced with a slight raising of his innate aura. It carried a near imperceptible wave of power and dominance that most mortals wouldn't notice, but judging by how she shivered in his arms, she was very much aware of it. And going by how she bit her lower lip as she gazed up at him, she liked it. He knew he had her at his whim in that moment, that she'd be vulnerable at this time, and how his actions more than anything could draw her in until she gave in. It sickened him. For a moment he felt like those very Olympians he detested, knowing that many of them used their awareness and subtle ability to read mortal minds to have an unfair advantage in their conquests. But he bit it down with ruthless self-control. He'd made this bed and now he had to lay in it. "Let's go somewhere quieter," he whispered as he drew his face closer to hers. She was almost quivering in his arms, but she nodded nonetheless. He gave a soft grin at that and with his arm still around her waist, led her out of the club. A few hallways and flights of stairs later, they were in a reception hall. How convenient that the club was attached to a hotel with prime view of the Florida beaches. It took him a few minutes to guide her to his rented-out suite, under the cover that he'd been in the state for a work trip. The trip was mostly silent, with both shooting quick glances at each other, neither sure how to go about this part, or if they really even wanted to. He was doing this for a mission, an ulterior motive, and though he tried to lie to himself about it, a way to get past that damn hurdle that has been blocking him for years, even before he dated Aphrodite's spawn. She was similar, wife cheated on and heartbroken for millennia, in a marriage that was not her own choice, left in a castle under the sea all but forgotten while her husband not only slept with others but sired child after child in his wake. One foregoing his thoughts of love and true union, giving up on his old-fashioned desire for courting before intimacy, the other resigned to her fate in a cruel world and desperately lying to herself in the need to stay faithful even as she teetered on the fine edge of finally rebelling against it all. Both hurting and broken, both using the other for a reason they couldn't admit to themselves. Soon they arrived at his suite and opened up for her, letting his eyes trail her figure as she observed the penthouse. It was rather simple yet stylish, with ceramic tile covering the expanse and navy blue painted walls. A granite-topped kitchen to the side, large living room with couch, loveseat, and large flat-screen TV. Close to the living room and divided by a waist-high wall was a small dining room, further on being the doors leading to a balcony overlooking the marina. But it was to the door on his right that she moved, leading to the master bedroom. He closed the door softly behind him, taking a moment to motivate himself to continue. It took him over a minute, but he finally got himself to move, his steps feeling heavy and clunky with the clack of his leather boots. He went to his room, wondering what he'd gotten himself into, but then his train of thought stopped once he looked in his room. There she stood against the partially open glass door leading to his balcony, just like the doors near the dining room. Her heels were kicked off and her gaze was locked firmly on the surf beneath, a gentle breeze caressing her raven locks. Even though he could only see the side of her face, from what he could tell, she seemed so carefree at the moment. Without all her guilt and fears weighing on her slender shoulders, her sea-green eyes reflecting the beauty of the very seas that birthed her. If she was beautiful now, he knew that within the seas she would be even more so, with the mere glamour removed and her legs turned into her natural mermaid tail. He must have been staring for too long because Amphora turned to look at him, giggling softly before speaking in a teasing tone, "See something you like?" Yes, he thought, but he only answered with a grin as he kicked off his boots and slowly made his way towards her. She looked at him with mixes of anticipation and slight fear, suddenly seeming so small and vulnerable to him. He couldn't explain it, but he both hated and loved the sight. He wanted to see her strong and proud like the sea goddess he knew she could be, but at the same time, it filled him with a primal sense of pride knowing that he could enact such a reaction from her. With that in mind, he carefully wrapped his arms around her. He gazed down into her eyes for a time before he slowly lowered his face to hers and claimed her lips. They were soft and supple, the taste sweet yet with a subtle tinge of salt. The kiss was soft and tender as he felt her gently wrap her arms around his neck, pulling him closer as he tightened his arms around her. Soon the kiss started to become hungry, needy. His hands lowered until they cupped her soft rear, kneading the tender flesh, eliciting a small moan from her. That simple sound ignited a fire in his chest as he grabbed more of her flesh before hoisting her up, making her squeal as her legs wrapped around his waist and he took them to the bed. They didn't separate as he lowered her onto the bed, now their tongues dueling as her arms and legs kept him close. He could feel her own heart hammering away through their touching chests, the heat that was building between her legs and right over his crotch. He couldn't help but groan as he rubbed forward only to get a returning moan from her as her hands trailed through his hair. He let his body move of its own accord, leaving his thoughts and doubts behind as he lost himself in the moment. Somehow along the way his shirt was tossed aside and his pants were open though still at his waist, while her dress had been hiked up enough for her lacy panties to be in full view, along with the top of her dress being pulled down enough for her breasts to mash against his naked chest. The warmth of her body, the silkiness of her skin, and her sweet taste was drowning his senses. So much so that he momentarily lost himself to his desire and in that moment moaned her name, her real name. Amphitrite. It was soft, a candid whisper at most, but it was enough for her to hear. "So you know who I really am," she whispered in a quivering voice as he broke their heated embrace enough to really look at her and find himself frozen. Her cheeks were flushed golden, her glamour having fallen to reveal her tinged skin and heaving breasts, her hair like a dark halo around her head. However, none of that truly caught his attention like what her eyes did. They were teary and quivering, showing her every uncertainty and fear. Of what she was doing, why, and what possible consequences would there be to this night. There was also the pain that she had kept so close to her chest for millennia bubbling out, desperately trying to break free in rebellion after so much heartbreak and empty promises. It was all there as clear as the brightest day he could bring, and in that moment he knew one thing. He couldn't bring himself to go farther. D.A. Chapter 78, Hard Choices I. There was also the pain that she had kept so close to her chest for millennia bubbling out, desperately trying to break free in rebellion after so much heartbreak and empty promises. It was all there as clear as the brightest day he could bring, and in that moment he knew one thing. He couldn't bring himself to go farther. He had a mission. Seduce Amphitrite, break the fidelity that had lasted the longest of any marriage within the Olympians, unravel the stability of Atlantis and so cripple their forces. Divide the sea kingdom between loyalty to their king, a conquering force, and the last dregs of loyalty to Amphitrite, daughter of Oceanus and actual royal of the sea. But he couldn't do it. She hadn't asked to be in her place, she hadn't wanted to be with Poseidon, but the choice was taken from her. Whisked away from her own sea gardens while her father fought the upstart Olympian, coerced into a marriage to spare her people and settle the last scraps of resistance against Poseidon. A captive within her own home. Too long she had been used as a means for others, and he would not be one of them. So with a gentle hand he slowly thumbed away the few tears that had started to fall down her cheeks. "Yes," he said softly. "Then why?" she asked in a whisper, even as she leaning slightly into his touch. "You must know the danger touching me will bring you. And I could ask you the same," he replied. "Why now of all times? You rarely come to the surface as is, and yet tonight you came with the obvious intention of breaking fidelity." She looked away in shame for a moment, her eyes becoming stormy, before she returned her gaze to him. "He's gone too far," she replied in a cold tone, even though he could hear the quiver underneath. "I tried to stomach it every time he took on a new lover. Being free and wild like his oceans he claims, she scoffed. However, I could deal with it as long as his conquests and their lives stayed far away from mine, but then all that business with one of his lovers began. You mean the murder of Mrs. Bloffus? He cut in, much to her apparent shock. You know, she asked, making him sigh as he sat back on his knees with her sitting up to look at him properly, never mind her exposed chest. Yes, it is not as well kept a secret as the Olympians think, he replied with a tired gaze. And how do you know? Hestia told a few days after it happened, was Amphitrite's simply reply before she glanced down for a moment and then continuing. But yes, that was the sign of his changes. Something happened to him after that. Even if I never truly loved him, I can't say that he wasn't romantic and kind at times, but, ever since that day he became colder. Cynical, more easily angered, and even more promiscuous. Then when Hestia disappeared he came back both enraged for his own failure to keep her safe and sad at her kidnapping. She paused for a moment as she bit her lower lip before looking at him. When Hestia told me about how he'd struck her, I was furious myself. I dismissed him from my bed and kept it as such for all those years, but when he seemed so utterly broken for his failure, I finally relented and tried to soothe him. And yet, it wasn't my name, he said, even in the middle of our union, and I kicked him out again. Whose name? He couldn't help but ask, even though he got a feeling he already knew who. Sally, was the hesitant reply before Amphitrite took a shaky breath. I don't remember too well what happened the rest of the night, only that by the end I left him in our chambers with an Atlantean crystal dagger in his thigh, and I left to my son's wing of the castle. I remained there for several days until I finally decided that I would be moving to my own personal wing and keep my distance from my husband, but when I went to our chambers. Amphitrite stopped as more tears started to come out and her breathing turned into choked sobs. Not being able to stand the sight of her crying, Jason moved forward to envelop her in his arms, caressing her back softly as she cried into his chest. He didn't know for how long he held her, but he didn't care. He simply held her, understanding her tears of heartbreak. After all, not too long ago he had wept the same and found himself in Hemera's motherly embrace. After some time she finally settled down until her crying broke into sparse sobs and occasional hiccups, but she didn't try to move away from him as she spoke softly. Never in all those years had he broken the sanctimony of our chambers. But this time, he brought one of his lovers, a mortal one, to my bed. And what's worse, he was telling her of how he'd make her a queen in her own right as I just stood there and then turned back to me and winked. I've never felt so utterly humiliated in my life, she said as she hugged him tighter. Is that all I am in the end? A trophy that can be discarded when I'm not shiny enough? A broken toy? No, he answered firmly as he pulled back so that he could look at her. You are more than that bastard could ever understand. He then cupped her face and made sure her eyes were locked with his. You're too good for him, Amphitrite, you always were. He bit his lip for a moment as he thought about what he was going to say. This was going completely against the plans, but he couldn't just leave her, not after hearing all that. So he made a choice. Come with me, he said, making her eyes widen, but he soldiered on before she could interrupt. I can take you away, far from the reaches of Atlantis. A safe place, a home where you can find happiness. But what about my people? She asked. The truth of Atlantis is that many of the merfolk think little of Poseidon and his hand-picked court. Many still favor the old ways in the time of my father, even if at times he himself had been rather cruel though fair. Without my presence they would begin to voice against my husband again, and I fear how he would retaliate now more than ever. To that Jason really couldn't think of a way to get around it. The truth was that of the Elder Council, not all the protogonoi had been on board to move on. Pontus and Thalassa, born only of Gaia, were much like her and wished for more control of the world at large. Oceanus had been the favored sibling of Pontus and so blessed by Pontus, giving Oceanus and Tethys their domains of oceans and fresh waters respectively. Thanks to Nyx they knew that it had been the two youngest members of the Elder Protogonoi that had hidden Oceanus after the First Titan War, and now Pontus was taking an active role. By rule of thumb all members of the new council were avoiding the oceans as best they could. Until they could devote their time to not only fighting the two remaining Elder Protogonoi but also isolating such a battle to minimize the risk to the mortal realm, they were effectively tied down in how they could go about with the seas. And it honestly scared him that he would be able to do little to help her if she was in the sea itself. Jason was strong, no question there, but even he would be hard-pressed to fight Pontus and Thalassa on their home turf, especially not if they had more support from other tidal titans and monsters. Still, Grasping at straws, Jason held a palm up and focused his power until a marble of pure light formed before he cast a mild glamour on it to make it similar to a pearl with a necklace. Once formed, he looked to Amphitrite again and placed the necklace in her hands before clasping them within his. Then if you can't leave with me now, then take this with you. If you feel like you are in danger or there is an emergency, crush it and it will bring you to me, he said sternly. Promise me that you will. I can understand that you feel responsible for your people, but there is only so much that you can do alone, but you don't have to stand alone. Amphitrite remained silent as she looked between his face and the necklace now in her hands, seemingly unable to believe that someone would willingly risk so much just to help her. Who are you? She asked softly as she looked into his eyes. He paused as he thought about that. Even when the time came to declare war, they planned on staying relatively hidden to feed the famous Olympian paranoia. What better way to undermine an opponent than one constantly looking over their shoulder and questioning their own allies while they moved within the shadows? But could he risk telling her his real name? If the Olympians knew, then anyone with a connection to them could be in danger, even the innocent and those having nothing to do with the war. Jason Grace, he found himself saying before he could stop himself. He wanted to bash his own head for that, but for the life of him, he couldn't bring himself to regret it right now. He should make her swear on Styx and her immortality for her silence, hell, even knock her out and simply have Mnemosyne wipe all her memories as is, but he couldn't do it. He just couldn't hurt her, wouldn't hurt her, not after she opened up to him like she had. However, it was her warm smile that really settled it for him. Those soft lips pulled into such a tender expression with her eyes gleaming in a happy glow, it was worth it. She then surprised him by leaning closer and giving him a soft kiss. It was the only true kiss of the night without either hiding something behind it. He returned it as his arms found her waist again, yet he didn't try to deepen it or pull her closer. The warmth and touch of the embrace was enough as is. After they pulled back, she flashed him another smile. Thank you, Jason, she said as she tied the necklace around her slim neck. He flashed her a smile of his own as he got up and snapped his fingers, returning their clothes to a proper state much to her surprise. She looked at him with curiosity, to which he found himself winking as he turned around. You know how to reach me, he said softly before letting himself dissolve into particles of light. A mission failed, and yet he wouldn't have changed anything about that night. D.A. Chapter 79, Hard Choices 2. Percy, a week later, POV. Percy sighed as he looked up at the ceiling of his wives and his room, mindlessly shifting the stars and probably giving an astronomer a headache right about now. His hands gently glided across silky skin as he let the warmth of the bodies pressed against him soothe him. He glanced down at the two jewels of his eyes, a tender smile forming on his lips. Rhea was to his left, her head nuzzled close to the crook of his neck while she hugged his arm to her chest. Hestia was to his right and slightly lower with her head resting on his chest and right over his heart with her legs tangling his. Both had a glow about them, their bodies exposed to the waist from the crumpled bedsheet were covered in little bite marks and hickeys, satisfied smiles on their beautiful faces. He had no doubt he was similar, covered in more aggressive bites and claw marks etched to the point his healing hadn't cleared him up yet. It was a little odd, he mused. Pleasant but odd. For the last week, ever since Rhea and Hestia had surprised him in Norway, every night had been long and loud hours of passion. Bodies rolling and caressing against each other, heated looks and honeyed words, his wives interchanging between being alluringly challenging and dominant to fully giving in and submitting to him, begging him for more. And in all of it his inner wolf recognized their behavior. The aggression and closeness, the rubbing themselves against his body, demanding to be taken again and again. They were reinforcing that they were his and he theirs, making sure that their scents were smothered on each other and claimed in the most primal way. And he loved every moment of it, even if he was curious as to why they suddenly felt the need to reassure themselves of their union. Every night he would always finish with cuddling and tender words of love, simply holding them and relishing in the intimacy between all three of them. Sure, to many it would have come off as possessive and clingy, but in truth he was comforted by that. Knowing that he was as desired by them as he did them soothed a shadowed doubt that had been etched into his heart ever since he learned about his ex's infidelity. And he knew that they had similar doubts from their own experiences, one being turned into little more than a token trophy and the other forced to silently watch as she was forgotten, all the while witnessing heartbreak and betrayal. All three of them would carry those insecurities for the remainder of their existence, but it was in those doubts that their union glowed brighter. However, now he was worried about what could cause those doubts to shoot up in his wives. Had he been inattentive while preparing for imminent war? Was his gaze lingering on other goddesses too much? Whatever it was he would gladly fix it in a heartbeat for them, but he needed to know Percy, came the sweet voice that broke him out of his thoughts. He glanced down again to see that both Rhea and Hestia were awake again, his hands having stopped stroking their backs while his thoughts progressed. He also noted that the room was decidedly colder, exactly 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Not enough to actually cause discomfort for either of his wives. Being married gave them perks with each other's domains, but it was noticeable. Everything okay, dear? Came Hestia's warm voice as she rested her head on her hands over his heart while Rhea adjusted to placing her chin on his shoulder while looking at him. He sighed before giving them a soft smile, his hands finding each other their hips and tugging them slightly closer. Fine, I was just wondering what's got you two so worked up. Both caught the question in his tone and shared a glance before Rhea spoke, being the usual voice of the two. Well, we just really wanted to show you that we love you, she said, skirting an answer. And I love you both as much, he replied with a cheesy grin before relaxing and continuing, but still, there's more to it, right? They shared another glance before Hestia spoke up this time. There is something else, she paused as she nibbled her lower lip shyly. It's a little complicated, so, just let us explain before you say or do anything. That piqued his curiosity, and with a slight nod, they began to explain what got them so anxious. His eyes kept widening, and at times he would have sworn they were trying to play a trick on him, but both remained serious, without tooth or hide of a lie. His heart sank slightly at hearing about what was happening to his sister, causing a whirlwind of conflicting emotions within him. He loved Andromeda, dearly so, but could he change how he saw her enough to help her? Would he in any way be taking advantage of her or the situation to break fidelity? Was it a one-time thing or more? All those questions popped in his head until Rhea noticed his troubled face and calmed him with a soft kiss followed by Hestia. Percy, Rhea said gently as she looked into his eyes. I know what you're thinking and your art. She needs this, and we could tell she was genuine about her feelings. But, I made vows to always be faithful to both of you, he responded as he cupped both their cheeks. If I did this, how would I be any different from the Olympians? How would it even be fair to you? Well, Hestia started as she overlapped Percy's hand with her own. We may have thought of a possibility. What? He asked hopefully, not wanting in any way to go against his sworn vows. Okay, she continued as she took a quick breath. We thought about how to get around our oaths and even spoke to Styx about it. That got him to raise an eyebrow. If anything, his queens were thorough in checking options before even proposing ideas. And even messaged Lady Chaos. The sum being that our oaths give leeway to what the three of us consider infidelity, so, as long as all three of us agree, we could have lovers. He couldn't stop his frown at that but didn't comment with the, wait and see, glance Rhea shot him. So, considering that we don't want Andy being bunched into the same type as Aphrodite, we thought about marriage. But we're already married, he interjected only to get pinched by Rhea while Hestia raised a dainty eyebrow at him. Shutting up now. Yes, we are, but there isn't really anything stopping us from having more marriages, Hestia answered before looking to Rhea as the lioness picked it up. However, if married, then there is the little thing about our roles in the council. It's already unusual to having two queens, and adding more is just more trouble than it's worth, so we thought back to how lords used to get official mistresses back in the old days of Europe without permanently getting screwed over with their wives. Basically, if you agreed to it, you would marry Andy as a consort. Officially a wife and equal to us personally, but not a queen on the council floor. However, Hestia continued with a look of mischief in her eyes. It still would be letting you have a lover all to yourself, so we thought that as a condition, she would be married to all three of us. Granted, that would take some explaining to, and people will still talk, but being official still makes it better, Rhea added while Percy just stared dumbly at them until he asked the first thing that came to him. But wouldn't she need to be into girls too for this? Has she ever said she isn't into girls? Hestia shot back, leaving Percy without a retort. He could not refute her. Hell, if anything, he at one point was rather relieved to catch Andy check out the occasional girl on their few trips to the mortal world. It saved him the worry of having to skin any would-be boyfriends alive. Granted, he'd only taken it at face value at the time and didn't consider it being an assured thing of which way his sister swung, since she'd sometimes eyed guys too. That usually led to him leaving with her quickly, otherwise he would maul said male within the hour. Taking his silence as a cue to go on, Rhea continued. We also thought this might make it possible to address the feelings of some others, she said in a slightly edgy tone. Percy didn't need her to name them, knowing that his shadows were harboring feelings for him. Lupus had grown exponentially ever since having private days with Medusa and Lamia while explicitly not letting him in on what they were discussing. The other two had been leaving the subtly and hidden glances behind over time, and a part of him honestly felt guilty about not being able to return that love in that way they wanted, but unable to bring himself to dash their hopes either. He cared about them and didn't want to hurt them, especially after all the three have been through. So, would that mean we'd have to marry them too? He asked tentatively, making Rhea snort. No, that option is the right thing to do for Andy after everything she's done for us. We also are considering her status as a primordial goddess and council member and what her union to us would mean politically. We may be in the 21st century, and no doubt by the time we unveil ourselves to the mortals there will be ruffled feathers, but there will also be those that approve or will at least be neutral about our relationship. However, we're still the three royals, and that comes with some perks and allowances, Rhea said with a smirk. So for Medusa, Lamia, and Lupa. Hestia and Rhea shared a look before replying cheerily, concubines. Percy blinked owlishly at them, getting an eye roll from his loves. Look, the last thing we need is every pretty face running up to us and bashing their eyelashes or flicking their skirts to try to get with us just to have a crack at one or all of us, Hestia explained. So, aside from Andy, getting marriage is an option if she accepts this and you accept it, she said with a softer look, knowing he was still very undecided about the whole situation. But those three do love you and are already sworn to you. You could already command them to do whatever you want and they would follow it, but taking oaths and officially becoming concubines to the throne as it were would discourage just any girl. Or possible guy, Rhea chirped while looking at Percy's slight frown in amusement. Or guy, Hestia amended, sounding all too amused herself. From approaching us unless they're willing to submit to all three of us. And naturally we would take any offers with a grain of salt, Rhea continued, plus having Andy would mean that no one would fake their feelings or intentions. Not to mention it would be hot helping you dominate a few cuties. That got her some odd looks from both Percy and Hestia. What? Lions do the same thing in prides. She defended while sitting up, causing a healthy jiggle of feminine delight to their appreciating eyes. Regardless of her kinks, Hestia giggled while ignoring Ray's pout. It wouldn't be strange for a king or queens to have concubines throughout the history of mankind, so why not use that to our advantage? We give the girls the chance, keep a clear hierarchy, and leave the heavier throne room dynamic untouched. Percy laid quietly as he digested his wife's idea, musing the pros, cons, and his personal feelings on the matter. Sure, it made sense with the way they put it and could work. Granted, there was the question of how his shadows or the other possible girls currently crushing on him or even on his wives that would willingly go along with the conditions. It would mean fidelity to them, or at least to all those within the harem. Now that was a word he never thought would be used with relation to him. But then his thoughts returned to the original subject of all this, Andromeda. Could he change everything with her? Did he even truly feel that way about her? He wasn't sure even if he knew he loved her, and would have likely done it if he hadn't already been married, but that was because he would have thought of helping her any way he could before thinking about his relationship to her. He sighed in frustration as he ran a hand through his hair before being pulled out of his thoughts by Hestia's squeal. Apparently his loves had been teasing each other about their tastes, and that led to Rhea pouncing on Hestia and beginning a ruthless tickle attack. Hestia was laughing hysterically while trying to futilely escape and bordering on tears and begging for mercy. The sight brought a smile and welcome distraction to Percy, but he knew he would need to make a decision soon. Please re-AWN. Or focus on pulling one kinky goddess off the other before things escalated into a sleepless night of coiling bodies and swearing by each other's name in the throes of passion. D.A. Chapter 80. Guns on the Dance Floor I. He moved steadily through his chambers, making short work of fastening his sweet tie. Pitch black against a tastefully gray Armani suite and pristine white-collared shirt. His shoes shined like polished obsidian and his hair had been grown out slightly to be pulled into a low tail of raven locks. His pale complexion and steely gray eyes contrasting as he checked himself in a full-length mirror one last time. Altogether he felt himself looking crisply formal yet tasteful, if one ignored the wails of agony coming from the faces of trapped souls within his suite. Granted, the faces were just barely visible. He would silence them before leaving, but for now he let them be. He then glanced back to his wife and queen, noting with some concern how she seemed to stare off into her own mirror. Dear, he said in a gentle voice unheard beyond the walls of his chamber, but his wife made no sign of having heard. Persephone, he called with a little more volume. She jumped slightly as she finally looked at him, her eyes clearing from their daze as she gave him a smile that failed to meet her eyes. Yes, honey. She returned as she stood from her vanity seat and smoothed out her dress. It was a lovely little number, reaching just to the knees with a teasing slit on the right side to show some creamy skin. Tight and giving a generous idea of her curves, the dress was a vibrant green to match her eyes with flowers designs etched around the lacy collar holding up the dress. With the back open, Persephone allowed her chestnut hair to flow free and spill nearly to her lower back. Lastly was a small crown of ebony with diamonds encrusted on it, matching his own bone crown with one large diamond. Are you feeling well? Hades asked as he stepped closer to gently touch her cheek. She leaned slightly into it, but before that Hades saw the flash of worry in her eyes. That concerned him though. For the last week or so Persephone had seemed to be more tense and restless. To all others she may have been able to fool with her queen mask, but he knew her. No one knew Persephone as well as he did after their millennia together, but he could not recall ever having seen her so distressed and unwilling to broach the subject. I'm fine, was her airy reply, again her eyes straying off his near imperceptibly. He withheld his sigh though and gave her a small smile as he offered her his arm. Perhaps after the party tonight she would open up about it. After all, today is a day for celebration. Today, the Olympian Council had called an emergency meeting and all were attending. What better time or place to execute a god? Is this, not in poor taste though? She asked softly as she glanced down at herself. To have a celebration on the eve of declaring war. What would you have otherwise? He returned as they slowly walked out of their chambers and down towards their own throne room. There are eons of bad blood directed at the council and many wish to see Olympus burn. Not to mention, this will finally allow all who have sworn allegiance to the primordial council to be together, even those that have been spying since near the beginning. There will be many to welcome tonight. Persephone gave no answer other than a noncommitted hum. With that they fell silent, and upon reaching their throne room, Hades gives one last nod to some of his top ghouls and ghosts that will be in charge of the underworld, the lead being one Mrs. Sally Bloffus, the newest of his 3 judges. Getting a smile and nod back from her, Hades and Persephone soon flashed golden, on their way to the Temple of Primordials. Medusa Pav. Medusa walked steadily through the Temple of Primordials, her gaze set on a large set of marble doors. The click of her black heels echoed through the chamber and she could hear the faint hum of chatter and such in the throne room as gods and titans of all sorts entered the chamber. She soon arrived at the door and fixed her strapless black dress, making sure that her dress didn't ride up too much, but it was dangerously short to begin with. At least she got to preen whenever she noticed her king's lingering gaze, and oddly enough her 2 queens as well. She still wasn't sure what had been decided with Andromeda, and the love goddess has been keeping a slight distance with them, but Medusa felt like there was more to it. She couldn't help but feel like she was being carefully watched by her king and queens, and yet, it gave her an odd sense of excitement. Oh well, maybe she would ask later in the night about it, but first she had to get Phoebe. So with that in mind she knocked on the marble doors, being mindful to not be too loud otherwise Phoebe would scold her, again. Not a second later the doors soundlessly slid in, and taking the invitation, Medusa stepped into Phoebe's office, the large and slightly dark expanse looking like it simply went on forever. She didn't see Phoebe around as she looked until a smooth feminine voice called her. Ah, Medusa dear, is it time? Medusa turned to see her friend, a smile on her face. The woman was a deadly beauty. Her snow-pale skin seemed to glow in the soft darkness of the chamber, her silvery hair cut to short bob just reaching past her chin. She wore a black and silver embroidered corset pushing up her sizable breasts exquisitely with her toned midriff exposed. On her arms were matching, elbow-length gloves and matching collar, her 6 pitch black eyes all focused on Medusa. 2 in the standard location with the 4 others in pairs just above her eyebrows and far smaller than her main eyes, the left one's partly covered by a bang. However, her differences didn't end there, with her lower half just past the waist being a monstrously sized black widow spider with the iconic red hourglass being silvery instead. Around her waist she wore a white miniskirt and each of her 8 legs was decorated with cloth collars and a white ring near the middle of the legs. Hello Arachne, is Lady Phoebe ready? Medusa asked after exchanging kisses on each cheek with Queen of Spiders. Yes, she was just having a little last-minute discussion, Arachne said with a little titter of laughter. She then turned and motioned for Medusa to follow. The pair seemed to walk on forever, their heels and claw-tipped legs clicking along what looked like a marble floor. As they moved the lighting shifted and where once nothing but darkness was, now became 4 figures. As they got close enough Medusa was confused to see what looked like Phoebe speaking to 3 young women suspended within wire. Phoebe, dressed in a white dress reminiscent of a chitin and her hair done up in a bun with two bangs framing her face, was looking annoyed as she studied the trapped women. To Medusa they looked like sisters with slightly tanned skin and rich brown hair. Sadly their faces were marred with cuts, along with their entire bodies pulled into painful positions. The wires were cutting through their own chitins and skin alike, dripping ichor along the floor as all three sisters gasped and twitched only for more pain as the wires cut deeper. Stubborn lot, Phoebe quipped as she finally turned to look at Medusa and Arachne. Yes. Mistress, Arachne started reverently, making Medusa wonder if she sounded the same when talking to Percy. It is almost time for the show to begin and the council is gathering. Ah yes, the Olympians are beginning their emergency meeting soon. Never thought they'd go as far as to inviting representatives from the camps and minor gods as well, Phoebe replied as she sparred one more glance to the three women, all of whom were glaring at her with pure hatred in their eyes. I will see you girls later then, she said cheekily. One of the women, the leftmost one, spit a glob of ichor but it fell short of reaching Phoebe. She looked at the divine blood with distaste before she flicked her wrist, a series of taut wires appearing connected to her fingers. That wasn't very nice, she chirped even as she flexed her fingers in, the wires holding the women responding in kind and constricting on the women. All three screamed as spurts of blood followed wherever the wires got tighter and Medusa heard a distinct pop as the middle one's arm was pulled too far back. She didn't really flinch at the brutal display, but the heavy breathing made her glance over to see Arachne eyeing Phoebe like a piece of meat with a mad blush. The S was strong with this one. Well then, let's be off, Phoebe said as she released the wires around her fingers and turned on her heels to walk away, Arachne falling in step to her right and slightly behind her. Medusa followed along, still wondering who were the girls and what had they done to deserve Phoebe's ire, but they soon faded from view. They walked in silence for a few minutes until Medusa let her curiosity get the better of her. Lady Phoebe, who were those three? She asked. Oh, I forget, no one has seen their true forms in eons, Phoebe replied while clapping their hands. Those were the Fates. The Fates? Medusa shouted as she looked at Phoebe as if she'd grown a second head. How? Why? Oh, it wasn't hard at all, Phoebe shrugged with an easy smile. I'm more connected to the realm of fate than they are now, and finding them was a simple matter. Sadly, negotiations fell within minutes and I had to take them in, or else they would have run off to the Olympians. But what have they done that needed your attention? Medusa persisted after getting over the shock of who the young women were. Simple. They've gotten a little too comfortable, too complacent with their power, Phoebe answered, her cheery demeanor falling through as she looked at Medusa intently. Annihilation once had her own laws on how and when she would allow others glimpses into their futures through prophecy. However, even she knew that there is no true set path until the moment has already passed. Until we make our most important decisions, entire realities are possible, many of them similar, others so distinct you'd think they don't even relate to the same person. Phoebe paused as she glanced up, Medusa following her gaze. She gasped lightly at the sight of thousands upon thousands of strings, all formed into interlocking webs of some kind, stretched on endlessly into the shadows beyond even Medusa's ability to see. Crawling across those webs were all manner of spiders working diligently, tying, removing, severing, and extending the lines between webs, and as they did so Phoebe continued on. The power of free will, it's what makes it all possible. That is why Lady Chaos made her laws to forbid gods encroaching on free will, even if we can create suggestions and ideas within mortal minds through the mist or our own abilities. Phoebe turned to look Medusa directly in the eyes, her own amber ones glowing with power. The Fates have forgotten this and instead use their prophecy as law and affect chance and probability to make them correct. They know that all fear the unknown and so grow dependent on their prophetic word, giving the Fates power over mortals and gods alike, but also creating greater risk for said gods and mortals themselves. I was merely asking them to reconsider their positions and learn to leave the gods and mortals to their own. And they didn't take it well, I'm guessing, Medusa finished as she glanced back into the darkness where the Fates ounce were. Not at all, Phoebe sighed as they finally arrived at the door leading out of her office. Equals 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 equals. Don't forget to throw some power stones to keep the story going. If you want to support me or just to read ahead of the public release, you can join my Patreon. Patreon Moonhorse.